Did you know that the word silly once meant something close to holy? Today, calling someone silly usually means they are acting a little foolish. But hundreds of years ago, the same word could describe someone who was blessed, innocent, and spiritually pure. So, how did a word that once suggested holiness end up meaning a bit stupid? Let's take a look. Today, in modern English, the word silly usually describes behavior that is playful, foolish, or lacking good judgment. If someone wears a ridiculous hat, makes a childish joke, or laughs at something trivial, people might say, "Don't be silly." Sometimes the word is gentle and humorous. For example, a parent might say it to a child who is making funny faces. But in other situations, calling someone silly can suggest that their behavior is immature or not very intelligent. In most cases, the word carries a mild sense of foolishness, but that was not always the case. The story of silly is actually one of the most dramatic meaning changes in the English language. In early medieval England, the word was used to describe people who were blessed and innocent. A silly person was someone pure, harmless, and deserving of kindness. But life in the Middle Ages was often harsh and dangerous, and in such a world, being innocent could also mean being vulnerable. People who were gentle and trusting were easier to cheat, manipulate, or take advantage of. Over time, the idea of being innocent began to overlap with the idea of being naive. And once a word starts to suggest naivety, it does not take long before it begins to hint at foolishness. So the meaning of silly slowly began to slide from purity to weakness, from innocence to lack of good judgment. The word itself comes from the Old English word selig. This word meant happy, fortunate, blessed, or even holy. It originally described someone who was spiritually fortunate or protected by divine favor. But the meaning changed in several stages. Around the 12th century, the word silly began to mean innocent or harmless rather than holy. By the 13th and 14th centuries, it began to describe someone who was helpless or defenseless, especially people who were poor or weak. Then, by the 15th century, the word shifted again. Now silly could describe someone who was naive or lacking good judgment. Finally, by the 16th and 17th centuries, the word settled into the meaning we recognize today: foolish, simple-minded, or ridiculous. In just a few hundred years, a word that once suggested holiness had turned into a mild insult. Interestingly, this kind of meaning change is actually quite common in language. Words that describe innocence or purity sometimes begin to suggest weakness, and once weakness appears, the idea of foolishness can easily follow. So the word silly is not alone in this journey. Many words slowly drift as societies change how they think about certain human qualities. Today, the word appears everywhere. In English culture, children's books often celebrate silly characters who make people laugh. Comedy films frequently include silly moments to entertain audiences, and English even has playful expressions like silly goose or don't be silly. These expressions soften the idea of foolishness and make it sound almost friendly. So today, the word feels light-hearted rather than harsh, and the journey of silly reminds us that words have lives of their own. A term that once meant blessed and holy slowly drifted through innocence and weakness until it became a word for foolish behavior. And that raises an interesting question. If language can transform holiness into foolishness, who knows what meanings today's words might carry a few hundred years from now?